This video was hard for me to make. Not that creating solid name ideas is difficult, it's that there are hundreds of great author-tube videos out there on this topic, and it kind of feels like, what's the point in little old me just adding to the mix? I realize that even with all this great advice out there, there's still writers who struggle with naming their characters. And while I feel that naming your character is a deeply personal decision, there are still many ways to learn how to do it. And today I'm covering my personal tips on how I choose a name for my fantasy book. This video is mostly going to be talking about fantasy names, but it will apply to any sort of genre that you write. Let me first say that if you are really struggling with a name, there is no shame in using a filler name until you have discovered the perfect name for that character. If you haven't already created a character profile, I urge you to do so. Spending time getting to know your character will only help that name come to you that much better and clearer. Tip number 1, what role and species are they? In order to choose a name, we must first decide what role this character is going to play. And how important are they to your story? Roles might include the main character, the villain, the trusty sidekick, the mentor, etc. My rule of thumb is the more important they are to the story, the more unique and creative and memorable their names should be. For fantasy series, it is also really important to look at the species. Elves, fairies, humans, pirates, wizards, vampires, and monsters are all gonna have slightly different names. And if they don't, then they should, to make your world believable. If you have a strong human female lead, it's important to pick a strong female name. A weak name just won't make that character very believable. Leave the weak names for background characters, people who are just passing through, people who are just going to be in your book for one scene. But how do you know if you've chosen a weak name or a strong name? That could depend on your personal preference for names. It could also depend on your subgenre. And this brings me to my second tip. Tip number 2, choosing names specifically for your fantasy subgenre. Choosing names for an epic fantasy book versus a contemporary urban fantasy book versus a romance fantasy will have names that vary widely. The great thing about epic fantasy, and to be honest, all fantasy books, is that you are free to invent brand new names. And these made-up names can have whatever meaning behind them that you wish that they have. That is, if meanings of names are important to you. My stories have a lot of unique names, and a lot of them are made up. I'll be the first to admit that I will use www.fantasynamegenerators.com whenever I am struggling. Hashtag no shame. By the way, whether you are a fantasy writer or not, go check out that website because it is full of hundreds of categories of names to choose from, and beyond that, thousands of names that they will give you. It is an incredible website. I'll also use this fantasy name generator to invent my own names. I'll see a name that they have given me on the list, and sometimes I will remove letters, add letters, move stuff around to create a whole new name. But remember, not every name has to be creative. In Terry Goodkind's Sword of Truth series, his main character's name is Richard, while the majority of all the other characters are pretty creative. Some creative epic fantasy names that you might recognize are Bilbo Baggins, Khal Drogo, Empress Lasine, Colin Omnell. Now, if you're writing a contemporary urban fantasy, it's very likely that you'll be using names of the modern day. In this case, my suggestion would be to use names that are known, but not well known, or not very common, or not very popular. For example, where I live, I might use a name like Celestia, or Broderick, or Ephraim, or Eliana. Those names are all really unique. I don't have any friends with those names, but they sound strong, and they're kind of fun and memorable, right? It also depends on the age of the characters. If you're writing a modern day piece versus a piece in the 1980s or 1920s, you might want to look and see what names were popular then. Use the Social Security Administration list to see all of these popular names. For romance fantasy, I again would suggest names that you've heard of, but maybe don't hear very often. They're not very common, but also they sound a little sexy, like Alessandro or Scarlett, Nicolette or Dimitri. Tip number 3, names to avoid. Yes, believe it or not, there are names to avoid when you're creating a character list. First, you're going to avoid multiple characters that have names that start with the same first letter. If you have Adam, Andrew, Amy, and Amanda all as your main characters, I guarantee you that your reader is going to be confused. Why? The reason confusion happens is because names that start with the same first letter have a tendency to sound the same. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, like Beatrice and Barbara, pretty different, or Andrew and Alfie. But names like Mary and Marty, Rick and Rich, are just too similar that you might even just confuse yourself. Please try and follow this rule if your characters are going to have any romantic relationship. And it's easy enough to change names. If there's an Evan and an Emma and a Kelly and a Kyle, people will get confused. If you're at all in doubt, just change one of the names. Avoid using family and friend names. I won't say much about this because it should be rather obvious, but don't use family names. Don't use your last name, your mom's name, your cousin's name, your sister's name, whoever, don't use their name. Don't use your ex's name. Don't use your best friend's name. Even if you have characters that are created after these people's personalities, just leave their name out of it. Unless you like the drama in your life, just avoid it. Tip number 4. Tip number 5, let the character choose the name. I have often heard of this notion that the author will wait until the character tells them their name. And this might sound crazy, especially if you're not a regular writer, but it's true, it happens. When I was first writing my current story that I just finished the first draft on, I was using a filler name for my main character. Her name was Kate. I had a sneaky suspicion way down in my gut that that was not gonna be her name and she was gonna have a way cooler name, which she does. Something just felt off, but I didn't have any other names in mind at that time, so I just kept going with it until finally the name came to me. And actually, I think I changed her name 2 or 3 times before I finally settled on her name. And the last name, don't even get me started there. I changed that a ton. Her real name, I'm not sure if I invented it or not, but I've never seen it anywhere else, so I'm not gonna mention it here. It came to me completely random one day out of the blue, and it was like, like I knew that was her name. It just had to be. And I love it, and it fits her perfectly. As they say, when you know, you know. Okay folks, that's all the time I have for you today on this topic of names. My name is Lisa Corries. I post new videos every Wednesday. If you like this video, please subscribe, please share it with your friends. Go find me over on Instagram at Lisa Corries Writes, and I will see you guys next week. Bye!